right, sweet. Welcome all. I hope that y'all are doing great. I hope that you had a fantastic and a splendid Thanksgiving. I imagine some of you were leaving Georgetown or leaving Washington, D.C. for your home. So if you did travel, I hope that it was as safe as it can possibly be in this present world we inhabit. I'm Matthew Hamilton. I'm one of the TAs. Probably about 45 of y'all know who I am if you are present. I'm a political theorist in Georgetown's government department working on my PhD in political theory. And Professor Nexon and I had discussed at the beginning of the semester trying to get into a little bit more of basically the ongoing discussions that are taking place in the field of international relations about race and international relations. So I'm going to jump into that now, and we'll go from there. So I will go ahead and share my screen. I will, Professor Nexon, per your normal arrangement, I will not be able to see any of the chat or anything. So if somebody is watching the chat, feel free to flag me. Otherwise, if you have a question,
why don't I do that? I will watch the chat.
Okay. I was going to say, anyone else, if you feel like speaking out, you're always welcome to just go ahead and do so. So give me 1 second. Right. So we should be seeing my PowerPoint screen. Are we good to go on that front? Awesome.
Yep.
Sweet. So as I said, this is going to be race, imperialism, and international relations with Matthew David Hamilton, with yours truly, and we shall commence. So I have 3 goals for this class period, 3 things that I really want to try to get into deeply and engage with. And so this first one is going to be understanding international relations, historical ties to racism and imperialism. So we'll get through this. That'll be the first segment. I'm going to have an outline here in a second that will follow this and is going to map onto these goals. Pretty straightforward, but that is goal number 1. Number 2 is going to be to interact with Black American IR theorists, especially W.E.B. Du Bois and the Howard School of International Relations. Now, you probably don't know what the Howard School of International Relations is. You might know who W.E.B. Du Bois is if you did the reading this week. But if these are new things to you, that's perfectly fine. That's kind of the whole point of doing this week, is to incorporate some of these marginalized voices into the normal discussions about IR that we're normally having. And then finally, this third one is to engage recent IR scholarship on the topic of race. So some of the scholarship that we're doing is more historical. It's talking about the development of the field, or it's talking about people who in the past have been marginalized and bracketed out of the field of international relations. But this last segment that we'll get to is just looking at a couple examples of how scholars today are thinking about race in the international context. So the outline, again, I said this is going to map on pretty much exactly onto the goals, but the first thing that we're going to do is history. We're going to look at the history of international relations. First of all, looking at the colonial origin of international relations, kind of the moment that it was birthed in and the early moments of its development. And then from there, we'll turn to a little bit of a conceptual point. And this is also going to be some of the weekly reading that hopefully you engaged with about anarchy. So this isn't just a story about the development of IR, the field, or the conferences we go to and the journals that we write in, but the actual content and the concepts that we are debating and that we're discussing in this class are tinged by this imperialism and this colonialist history. And so we'll talk a little bit about anarchy and its relationship to realism there to, again, get a sense of the development of international relations and how that development is implicated and is tied up with specifically American racism. The second thing, again, we'll pivot to W.E.B. Du Bois and the Howard School. There's going to be 3 figures in the Howard School that I'm going to engage with fairly briefly. This is going to be Alaine Locke, Ralph Bunche, and Mirza Tate. And so these 3 figures, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois, I'm going to give just kind of a brief overview, a brief introduction to these figures so that you can have some familiarity with who they are and their contributions to international relations. And then finally, we will pivot over, as I said, to the scholarly discussions now, looking at how race impacted the Cold War and U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War, looking at race and international law, and then finally discussing a bit of a different take that engages race, caste, and Indian international relations. So without further ado, I will jump into demythologizing IR. And the first question that might be asked is, like, why does this matter? Like, why are we doing this? Sure, so maybe international relations has this history, but if we've changed, if we've developed, if we're no longer doing this, then does it matter that much? I contend that it does matter, in part because, as I noted earlier, many of the concepts we engage, like anarchy, have racist origins. And if we do not either cast the concepts aside entirely or spend significant time re-theorizing them, then we are likely to reify the racism that's implicit in these discussions of international relations. So IR has been increasingly grappling with its own racist history. A lot of the scholarship, even on the history of it, is taking place in the past 10 to 20 years. I lost my place, but so we're in the process of discovering this right now. And actually the class that you've taken with Professor Nexon is a bit of a change or a pivot in the way that international relations is normally taught, and an attempt to get away from some of that mythology that has bracketed the racism of international relations beginning. So because of that, there isn't quite as much for y'all to unlearn, but I do think it's still important to dive into this to understand where this all began and where the conversations initially took place. So the first myth that we're going to engage is our favorite Greek historian, Thucydides. And so, as I noted, Professor Nexon hasn't inculcated you with all of the bad international relations mythology, but most international relations classes want to start with Thucydides. And you did interact with Thucydides a little bit with Gilpin and the theory of hegemonic wars. But Thucydides is shown as kind of this like origin figure of international relations because he tells the story of the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides has this moment of this whole narration. There's one small moment where the Athenians, this strong, powerful bunch, are coming up to the Melians and they're going to conquer them. And the Melians, this really, really small group of people, appeals to them and says, no, trust me, trust us, be just. Don't do this. The gods are going to discipline you. You know that this is wrong. They basically claim to have the moral high ground. The Athenians respond something to the effect of, well, the strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must. And this is portrayed as kind of the beginning of this logic of power politics, that there's this anarchic realm and that it's the strong are going to do what they can, and the weak just have to deal with the consequences of this. Now, to be clear, my ancient Greek political thought professor would not allow me to get away with saying Thucydides, to be clear, was not advocating this. To say that this is Thucydides' thought is like saying that any character in a Shakespeare play represents Shakespeare's own thoughts. But the reality of international relations for our purposes is that its birth was actually very clearly tied to US imperialism. So we're going to see a couple things in this slide. This is beginning in the 1890s and the 1900s. And initially, this really begins with debates over the Spanish-American War. And more importantly, the subsequent imperial administration after the Spanish and American War. So there were various bodies that were a part of this, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, that were being contested over. And ultimately, there was the justification for the US to go to war, but then there was also the question of if the US fought this imperial war and won, that it was now in charge of ruling over these different protectorates. And you can look at this propaganda poster here. This is actually a really, really, really good visual for something that I'll return to a number of times. So if you look closely, you can see it's a Puerto Rican flag. And you can see in the middle, there's the word anarchy, where there's like fire and smoke and everything's combusting. And then I don't know if you can tell, it might be too small, but at the very bottom of it, it says the duty of the hour to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate. And so the implication of this poster, the implication is that Puerto Rico needs the white United States to rule. That without the white imperial power of the United States of America, that Puerto Rico itself will fall into anarchy. And so these are the conversations, these was the perspectives that began the genesis of the international relations field. One prime example of this is the American Political Science Association, which if you take classes in the government department, I can pretty much guarantee that your faculty members will attend. That's not for me to throw shade at any of them, because if I am successful at all in this field, I'm sure that I will attend APSA as well. But around this time, the American Political Science Association convened its first meeting. And again, these conversations about imperialism, about colonial administration, were really the focus of the discussions that were taking place. So much so that one attendee called the main discussion said the main discussion was about the science of race subjugation. It was into this context that W.E.B. Du Bois made his famous comment that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And so that might strike some of us, maybe not all of us, but that might strike some of us as a bit odd, that the number one problem in the 1900s was the problem of race. But when W.E.B. Du Bois made this comment, it wasn't a controversial claim at all. It was something that was normal part of the international relations discourse, something that has been bracketed for far too long. Continuing forward a little bit further in time, we run into foreign affairs. And foreign affairs is similarly a major organ of the field of international relations, a place where a ton of international relations scholarship and literature has been published. But one small under-discussed portion of it is that the Foreign Affairs Journal was originally called the Journal of Race Development. Now, there could be a fairly reasonable pushback. Again, this is, what's in a name? And we should have asked the important question of does this matter? Does it matter that it had this name that now we look back on and say, hey, that's kind of problematic? The point that I think is important to take away from this is that the initial name, the initial nomenclature, the thing that it was called, the Journal of Race Development, tells us about the subject matter that was being debated in international relations infant stages. Raymond Leslie Buell, an ardent segregationist and figure to which we will return later, laid out the two fundamental problems for IR, according to him, which were imperialism and discrimination. This being in his super popular textbook, International Relations. So now we've moved forward into the interwar period. We're after World War I, but before World War II. And another huge discussion that's taking place is the prospect of a race war. And since we are using mostly very, very, very serious topics throughout this, I did have to include some levity with a meme that I feel like you have probably all seen a million times, as it's very old at this point. But it's something that I still laugh at every time I see, and that is Wesley Snipes crying as he points a gun in a movie that is older than me, probably older than you, saying, when the race war is happening and I got to kill Tony Hawk, to which Tony Hawk responded, I appreciate the hesitation, though. So race war might seem like a meme or something very odd and not normal to us, but at the time, this was a very legitimate topic of conversation in international relations circles. Movements for political autonomy had taken place in South Africa, Egypt, etc., and the white colonial order began to fear that there might be an uprising against its rule. At the same time, the communist order often allied with these movements, preaching self-determination rather than rule by whiteness. It should be included, too, that these conversations about race war were not simply stoked by white fear or the fear of those in power, but that Du Bois and Alaine Locke both discussed this possibility as well, Locke specifically mentioning the possibility of violence as a rationale to advocate decolonization. So finally, we turn to this more conceptual turn, pivoting away from the strictly historical inquiry and looking at anarchy. And this gets into the Henderson piece that was the required reading. And in international relations mythology, generally it's said that anarchy is just the way the system is. That's just, can't do anything about it. That's just how life is. And you just ultimately have to deal with it. However, this category, as with everything else, was largely developed from racism and colonialism. So we cannot exactly change the history of international relations development, but we do need to ensure in our theorizing and our analysis that we haven't just baked racism into it. And anarchy is one of those questions that therefore needs further interrogation. The weekly reading, the Henderson piece, explicates how Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant, etc. theorized the state of nature. And during the colonial projects, they saw white people as human, civilized, fully developed, etc. and the colonized nations or the colored nations as primitive, underdeveloped, subhuman, or as they often said, savage. It is from these colonized subjects that this idea of anarchy was birthed. And importantly, as Henderson argues, the implicit point was that white civilization could slide back into anarchy. They could descend to the purported level of the colored nations if certain practices were not upheld. So we saw this logic already in that poster of the propaganda poster for the Spanish-American War. The idea that the Puerto Ricans, without the benevolent white dictatorship, could not rule, that they would simply descend into anarchy and that their own self-rule would be worse than the rule of white Americans. Related to this, I include this comment by Charles Darwin that crops up in a lot of these conversations, where Darwin says, "Such were our ancestors," referring to the savages of the colonized people. So when Darwin, like Kant and other people before him, saw the colonized people, he theorized that they were biologically inferior to the white races because they were not as fully evolved. White civilized Europeans had evolved from what he considered the inferior races. And this biological foundation for racism was a philosophy against which Du Bois and our Howard School thinkers had to fight regularly. Deeply tied to this idea of anarchy is the field and the perspective of realism. And we've engaged realism some. It hasn't been the most prominent thing, but there's a number of very famous realists who we would normally associate or perhaps think that they founded the school. And you could look at Reinhold Niebuhr, or you could look at E.H. Carr. Hans Morgenthau is another very prominent name who will come up later in our discussion, or Kenneth Waltz, who we read in class. But actually, the person who originated this term, who coined the term realism, was notorious white supremacist intellectual Lothrop Stoddard. Stoddard will come up again shortly, but I include this quote from him here to again reiterate the residual racism contained within this kind of theorizing. So Stoddard says, "Become clear-sighted realists or take the consequences." Stoddard here again reiterates what we've seen in this Puerto Rico poster, as well as the Enlightenment theories of the state of nature. The idea is embrace this crass power politics or suffer the fate of the uncivilized races. So that's the brief recap. That's the real hard history, the origin of the field of international relations. It's obviously, that's a very large overview. That's painting with a very broad brush, but hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the development of this field and how the concepts that we've inherited are spawned from this racist imperialist line of thinking. I will pause there briefly before moving on to W.E.B. Du Bois and the Howard School in case you have any questions on that kind of macroscopic history. Awesome. So we will move forward. All right, so now turning to Du Bois and the Howard School. As I discussed the outline, the goal here is to outline and engage some Black IR theorists who are contributing to the field at its early stages. These figures have largely been bracketed from the field, the international relations field, though they are being recovered to certain degrees right now. I, for example, know of one book on Du Bois's international thought that is in development right now. Just as, you know, America as a whole continues to grapple with its racist history, the field of IR does the same. So the authors that we are about to engage have been excluded from international relations histories for two main reasons. The first is the historical development of the field. As I mentioned, the field started with this real focus on colonialism and imperial administration, but it shifted after World War II and during the Cold War era. Imperial administration was no longer the focus as America and the USSR vied for global dominance. Most white scholars shifted their focus to this great power context, or at least most prominent white scholars shifted their focus to the great power contest, even if this contest obviously, and as we will see, had deeply important implications for colored peoples around the world. The mythologies of the field today generally skip from Thucydides to this great power duel, so they overlook the original colonial discussions to which these authors continued to contribute. More than this, it must be stated explicitly that these figures were often excluded because of their race, because of their gender, because of who they were as a person. One historian remarks that Raymond Leslie Buell, who I quoted earlier, was the only white intellectual who would engage Black theorists as intellectual peers around the 1920s and 1930s. And while Buell did open doors for some members of the Howard School, he was also a committed segregationist who, for example, opposed Japanese immigration for racist reasons. This then was the setting into which these figures theorized. Even the few white supporters or interlocutors were not committed to their own liberation. We'll begin with W.E.B. Du Bois. Here he is, 1868 to 1963. As I mentioned, more work is being done on him at this point. He was a sociologist, and much of his study for the past several decades has taken place in African American studies departments, but he's finally being revitalized and rightfully engaged on a broader range of topics. I had not heard of him until my years in seminary, but hopefully you've read him this week, and hopefully he can be somebody that you keep in mind in the future. So as I've hinted at a number of times, this biological racism was a philosophical problem in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Du Bois found himself fighting vehemently against this all the time. He had numerous debates with our friend Lothrop Stoddard, the figure I referenced earlier as coining the term realism. I'll recount one anecdote that I enjoyed greatly. At this time, this was the last debate between Stoddard and W.E.B. Du Bois, but at this time, Stoddard had evolved. He was no longer a biological racist, just a committed segregationist. He no longer held that Blacks were necessarily inferior, only quote unquote different. This led him to essentially advocate an extension of Jim Crow-style rules to the international order. In the debate, this final debate with Du Bois, Stoddard voiced his bigoted views. Ooh, that scrolled the wrong thing. We'll start here. Stoddard voiced his bigoted views, declaring, "You shall not marry our daughters." And Du Bois replied, "Who in hell asked to marry your daughters?" So Du Bois' more substantive contributions consist in his advocacy of democracy both nationally and internationally. The weekly reading highlights this. It was only like 7 pages, and perhaps without context, it doesn't make all the sense in the world. But hopefully you can see Du Bois' major democratic point. How could a small number of Belgians, for example, determining the political life of a multitude of Congolese be considered a just democratic system? Du Bois thus advocated for self-rule, for decolonization that would allow for the formation of democratic states in Africa and elsewhere. Now, these vignettes I offer will not be hagiographies. I do want to include at least some of the complexities we find in these people's works. Du Bois offers one of these. While he advocated for this self-determination, this democracy, he did leave open the possibility that protectorates could be needed for a time. He recognized that simply allowing total liberation could open the door for another colonial power to waltz in and overpower the nascent state. Thus, he allowed for some temporary quasi-colonial rule to build up the nascent states until they could self-govern. And if we wanted to engage with Du Bois more deeply and think through the relevance of his thought for the field of international relations, these are the kinds of questions that we would have to grapple with. Du Bois also made important developments in theorizing the state of the colonized. The biological racism had been used to explain the deprivation and poverty in the colonies, but Du Bois argued instead, and quite successfully, that the suffering faced by colonized peoples was not due to their own inabilities, but rather historical facts, like the slave trade and colonialization. Additionally, and this will be a major point of tension for him and our future authors, he rejected an orthodox Marxism, which united people by class in favor of something that tends more toward a Black nationalism and certainly Pan-Africanism. For Du Bois had seen the alliance between wealthy whites and poor whites, how they were able to ally against Blacks of all classes in the United States, and saw that this was a line that he believed could not be overcome. And it was because of this that Black Americans and Africans needed to build up their own structures and needed to create their own systems outside of the white system, because he thought that that could never be bridged, essentially. It couldn't be bridged by class lines, I should say specifically. Next, we have Alaine Locke, 1885 to 1954. And while you may have heard of W.E.B.'s Du Bois at some point, it is probably less likely that you have heard of Alaine Locke. But interestingly enough, we do have this great quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who says, "We are going to let our children know that the only philosophers that lived were not Plato and Aristotle, but W.E.B. Du Bois and Alaine Locke came through the universe." So I'm scrolling again. So this again testifies to the importance, the relevance of these figures being likened to Plato and Aristotle, even if they might have been bracketed from the largely white international relations discourse. So Alaine Locke is known as the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, and Harlem was very important for his theorization. He saw Harlem as justification for Black liberation struggle and for essentially Black rule. Liberation struggles have been successful in places like Ireland and India, as I mentioned earlier, and to him, Harlem communicated that Blacks were capable of self-rule and deserved that opportunity. Locke was also the genius of the Howard School, which before we go any further, we must turn to and discuss briefly. So you might be asking, I keep saying this, what is the Howard School of International Relations? What am I talking about? Well, in concrete terms, it's Howard University, the HBCU up the street from us. Is not too far away from Georgetown. But the Howard School of International Relations is a category of scholars that we have created, we've kind of put all together, that were affiliated with Howard in various capacities and contributed to the field of international relations throughout the 20th century. It's kind of a made-up term. They wouldn't necessarily have thought of themselves as the Howard School of International Relations in the same way that Plato and Aristotle would not think of themselves as ancient Greek philosophers, having no concept of ancient and maybe no concept of Greek. But it is a way that we have grouped scholars together who are in the same period, talking about similar things, and are affiliated and linked through their relationship to Howard University and oftentimes to one another. So back to Locke. He was the genesis of what we call the Howard School, but the beginning of the Howard School actually started with Locke's firing. He was fired by the last white president of Howard, but then he was able to get a grant to study the mandates internationally. While he never submitted an actual final copy of his research, in part because he was doing incredible things like creating museums in Harlem, this research that he worked on started the idea of what we now call the Howard School, a department focused on race as an international relations problem or phenomenon, and he wanted to attract scholars to theorize in this vein. Now, Locke anticipated how America's domestic racism problem would generate problems for leading an international post-war coalition, as oppressed colored peoples were likely to increase in number and power. In effect, he foresaw that if America wanted to be at the front, if they wanted to lead internationally, that other nations would be unlikely to join if there was not racial equality in the United States. Why would other states follow the US if it couldn't get its own house in order to begin with? And finally, like Du Bois, he fought against resurgent biological racism, arguing in his book, in his work, Race, Context, and International Relations, that the rise of racial science had more to do with modern imperialism than biology. And again, I mentioned earlier in terms of the race war, this notion he did contribute as well. Locke argued that continued oppression would lead to violent resistance from the subjugated, contributing to the race war that I mentioned earlier. He was not necessarily advocating that. He was just saying, if you continue to oppress people in these ways, you should expect that at some point they will fight back. Next, we have Ralph Bunche. It's a great picture of him. Ralph Bunche joined Howard University in 1928. Interestingly, this is one of the internal debates that we get from these thinkers. Contrary to Bois, he rejected racial identification as the basis for organizing in the political arena. This was because of his commitment to Marxism. He thought that if there was going to be any true liberation for Africans worldwide, it could only take place with the overthrow of capitalism. And so because of this, he found that it was more important to identify along class lines than it was for racial lines. Now, his magnum opus, book titled A Worldview of Race, is in the same vein as this. It exposited unjust economic relationships internationally that racism had helped to disguise. So he was approaching this from a little bit more of an economic angle, but actually pivoted later in life. He became less of a scholar and actually worked in the government in his later years, working for the state, something that was wildly unexpected for a one-time committed Marxist. There's some debate over why he took a position in the state, why he was willing to work with the United States government in this time. And the simplest explanation seems to be that he was just at a point in his life where he was ready to settle down. He'd bought a house in DC, and I believe he had a child, and it was, it was time to focus on those things. But he was also very successful as like something of a non-scholar as well. He did become the president of the American Political Science Association, the organization I referenced earlier. He became the first African American to win the Nobel Prize due to his diplomatic efforts, and he assisted in the creation of the UN human rights regime. His time in the state also demonstrated the veracity of Locke and Du Bois' considerations regarding U.S. imperialism. In one conversation with the British, he pushed them to allow for self-rule in the colonies, and they responded that America needed to resolve its own racism problems before they told others how to act. Interestingly as well, his work with the state led him to notify some Howard School figures that they were under investigation by the FBI. To the best of my knowledge, nothing actually came of these investigations, but this again just gives you a bit of a sense of the environment in which these theorists were working. Finally, we turn to Mirza Tate, probably the most interesting one in my humble opinion, based on some things that I'll get into now. So at the time that she joined Howard, she was arguably the most accomplished international relations scholar there. She became the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in government and international relations from Harvard. But unfortunately, she experienced discrimination at Howard. The first of which was just straight up misogyny. Ralph Bunche, who I just referenced, specifically tried to block her appointment, leading to her working in the history department rather than the political science department. There's also catalogs of other faculty members who just compiled all of their misogynistic complaints against her. So that was one thing that contributed to her position in the discussions today. Additionally, she was a little bit more cosmopolitan and not quite as radical in perhaps her personal politics as some of the others. She was more of a scholar, interested in research on colonialism and not always the African colonies, and was often less interested in the revolutionary politics that was typical of many at the Howard School. Her major work is the disarmament illusion. But I'll be candid and say I couldn't actually find too much great information on her work. And because of that, I just had to buy it myself off Amazon. So I'm awaiting it to get more information. What I am able to understand is that it focused on disarmament as a political rather than a moral problem. And so she refused to paint the US as the good guys and Germany as the bad guys, but to look at the situation of disarmament as one that was just an outcome of raw politics. It's because of this that she received tremendous praise from Hans Morgenthau, one of the major proponents of realism that I mentioned earlier. And this, again, probably indicates the shift that's taking place in the field that moves away from this focus on colonial administration to one that deals more with raw power politics and something vaguely akin to realism. After this book, she chronicled imperialism in the Pacific, studying Australian and New Zealand expansion. And then she also pivoted to American imperialism, spending more time in the Pacific investigating US activity in Hawaii. Lastly, she's a bit of a forgotten forerunner to many deeper analyses in kind of sociology as well as international relations. After the great power politics kind of had their heyday, people began to focus on more granular studies that focused on smaller enterprises that contributed to hegemonic expansion. And Tate had actually already done this. She had unpublished manuscripts on what she called the sinews and arteries of empire, detailing railways and mining sectors in Africa. She also looked at missionary involvement with the US and compared that to Britain in terms of maintaining a colonial presence. In effect, therefore, she saw how economic, religious, and other enterprises can strengthen imperial power, something that would become more prominent several decades later. So brief recap of that, just again tying that up, tying it all together, a little bit of what we did. We covered some vignettes of the excluded voices, people who contributed to the IR conversation in varying degrees in various ways at the time, but have now been marginalized for the variety of reasons that I noted. I also highlighted how they researched different things. They talked about economics, or they talked about democratic theory or power politics. Their contributions can't be distilled down to like one major key, and they weren't univocal in asserting those things, which leads to this idea that there were disagreements among them. There's disagreements, especially over this idea of Marxism, whether you identify by class, whether you identify by race, and the impact of that and the importance of that for international relations. So I will once again pause. I'm going to take a drink of water myself, and then we will jump into the last third of this. Does anyone else have any other questions that they would like to ask at this moment? All right, so we have race and Irish scholarship. Sweet, we can keep moving forward. The next slide actually has words on it. All right, so what I've highlighted thus far has basically been like almost entirely history. But as I mentioned at the beginning, current international relations scholarship is often dealing with recovering IR history. It's elevating these voices, it's listening to what they have to say, bringing them back in and theorizing with them in mind. But there's also more scholarship now that that engages with race as a phenomenon in the international order. And so we're going to look at both of them. We're going to look at 3 different articles that engage race in some various particular ways. The first one is going to be The Cold War, American Anti-Communism and the Global Color Line by Richard Seymour. Unfortunately, this is not the famous defensive end who played for the New England Patriots. I did check, it is not. But so this is a similarly historical project. Essentially, the idea that anti-communism justified white supremacist policies and sentiments for a time. And eventually, the US approved gradual racial reform to make liberal capitalism more appealing. Now, when I say that, hopefully it kind of triggers in your mind, like that almost sounds exactly like what some of the theorists we were just talking about were arguing, that if the US wanted to be the leader internationally, that they needed to clean up their own house first. And Seymour, in a certain sense, corroborates that point here. He spells out 2 different waves of anti-communism. The first one is going to be post-World War I with this Wilsonian liberal internationalism. And essentially what takes place here is that the West, the US, is able to co-opt this idea of self-determination and reinterpret it in a decidedly racist frame. So self-determination or self-government or self-rule was reinterpreted to be something that was a privilege of whiteness. If you are white, you are civilized and you can rule for yourself. If you are not, then you could not, and you are not able to self-determine. Along these lines, rebellion of the racially oppressed classes was often portrayed as a communist plot. And so this anti-communism, therefore, was used to justify and legitimate violence against communist plots, which ended up being violence against non-white peoples. The second wave is the Cold War era. And so to reiterate some of the points I made before, we've now made this turn where IR is more focused on these kind of great power rivalries, but decolonization efforts have found some amount of success. And thus the US reforms its own racial hierarchy to, or at least like fakes to reform its own racial hierarchy to entice nation states into liberal democracy. Nonetheless, Anti-communism still provided cover for imperialist and racist wars like Korea and Vietnam. There's actually archival work that's been done that demonstrates some of the comments made by US government officials that make this, like, these wars very clearly, like, they very clearly have a racist edge to the actual activity. So a good kind of summary that just kind of gives an overview of the claim that Richard is making says, ultimately, anti-communism supplied the narrative ballast for the deployment of outright violence when US strategists deemed it necessary. So ultimately, this cover of anti-communism enabled the US to fight wars along racial lines, to fight something along a race war in order to preserve the white international order. It provided the cover, the justification, the reason. It was the way that the American government was able to sell this war to its people and to the world. Next, we have Robert Knox. And so this is a really complicated piece. It's racialization and rivalry in the international legal order. And so without getting too deep into, this again, before I get into that, this is dealing less with the real, like, kind of historical work, and is now shifting more to this idea that race is something that actually impacts behavior, that race is something that changes the way states act, and specifically this idea of racialization. So without going too far down the rabbit hole of international law, we can think of most international law as an agreement between states. And when international law happens, it's usually two states coming together, signing a treaty, signing a trade deal, whatever it is, and agreeing to abide by certain conventions. Like, you can think of the Geneva Convention, etc. States sign off and say, hey, I'm willing to be a part of this. Now, Knox wants to argue that there's racialization occurring at two different levels of this. And it's both, in both cases, it's driven by imperial rivalry. And the first is the binary that's created between the powerful states and the not powerful states. And so the powerful states are the ones who are in this kind of inter-hegemonic rivalry, and they write the law in such a way that they can effectively intervene on the less powerful parties. So you might have heard at some point in your life this literature called responsibility to protect. The US is often, pretty regularly, talks about going to war using humanitarian intervention because there's some oppressed people group that we need to use our troops to protect, to save from their own government. Now, Knox contends that essentially this is a similar racialization. This is the racial logic that we've seen throughout this entire presentation. In the same way that the US fought the Spanish-American War because, oh no, if we don't rule Puerto Rico, they're going to descend into anarchy. This is now codified into international law. This is a defense of humanitarian intervention so that powerful states can intervene and essentially rule over the weaker states. And one way to kind of prove this is to demonstrate that when the US commits human rights violations, nobody has a responsibility to protect people that we are oppressing. There's an ongoing joke on Twitter and stuff about during the election that we needed Iran or Iraq to invade us and impose democracy upon the United States. And it's a joke. It's funny because the way the international law has been set up empowers certain actors and puts other people at the mercy of their action. But Knox's real focus is actually on the second part of this racialization, and that's the inter-hegemonic rivalry, where the powerful states are racializing each other when they basically prove problematic. So if the US wants to do some sort of military operation and China's like, no, we're not going to, that's not cool, we're not all right with that, then the US doesn't want to just upend the entire legal order. And so they're going to have to rewrite law, they're going to have to mix things up to try to create the kit to maintain their hegemonic status in the legal order while also circumventing China's wishes. And so in these cases, there's a lot of stuff that's thrown around that China is called outdated or China is called childlike, et cetera, so that there's a certain racialization between the US and these other rivals that the US is trying to circumvent. So this is, again, just kind of like a summarizing quote. Knox says, international law plays an absolutely key role in instantiating the racialized relations of imperialism, with rivalry being a key part of this process. So again, the idea that there's these rivalry between the great massive powers in the international system, and this allows for a racialization of the weaker states so that the more powerful states can intervene with impunity. And then there's also a racialization internal to that rivalry, where states racialize each other to legitimate and justify their like kind of making caveats in the legal order without upending it entirely. Finally, we turn to a post-colonial racial spatial order by Sankar and Krishna. And this gets to almost more of a theory of race and some of the intersectionality that was brought up earlier. And so the main idea here is that if we deal with strictly binary categories of white, black, Western, non-Western, this kind of thinking can actually conceal similar hierarchies operating within the marginalized. And Krishna uses Gandhi and Ambedkar to exemplify this point. So gives a ton of information, explanation of Gandhi. So essentially there's a bunch of information on Gandhi. Gandhi was largely overlooking the indentured servants, the Indian indentured servants. The movements that were being pushed, that he was working for, that he was pushing for, was largely like a quote unquote revolution, but for the like upper middle class, the best castes in Indian society. One example of this is when the British was fighting an imperial war, when the British were fighting an imperial war in South Africa, he sought extra military opportunities for some of his fellow Indians in order to kind of like boost their status in the colonial order. Similarly, in this really tragic, kind of comic, but also very tragic moment in Indian political history where Ambedkar is able to get a separate electorate for the Dalit, the most subjugated, the most oppressed caste in Indian society. And Gandhi says, hey, if this is law, I'm going to starve myself to death. And so Ambedkar ends up conceding to Gandhi because he doesn't want to see Gandhi kill himself for representation of the Dalit. And then finally, Gandhi is considered a hero of the international nonviolence and something of an anti-pope to power politics. Now, to be clear, Krishna's point here is not just to bring Gandhi down and to trash Gandhi. In fact, Gandhi just seems to be fairly typical of his class in that era. But the point is to show that his class of Indians set themselves as interlocutors for a different demographic, a more oppressed demographic in the Dalit, and they set themselves as interlocutors between the white international order and these lower Indian castes. Ambedkar, on the other hand, suffered segregation himself. It's you can see a lot of similarities with kind of Jim Crow rules, with being forced to use separate drinking fountains, I believe it was, being separated in the classroom from the other students. But he became a spokesperson and an advocate for India's Dalit population. I mentioned he ended up conceding to Gandhi because he didn't want to see Gandhi starve himself to death, even though he had achieved a separate electorate for the Dalit. But even with all of this, Ambedkar is largely excised from contemporary Indian international relations scholarship. So the quote from Krishna to kind of sum things up is, there's no easy category called non-Western when it comes to our understanding of global politics. The leaders of anti-colonial resistance are themselves from societies with deep and troubling imbrications of caste, hierarchy, and inequalities that are still ongoing. And so this is Ambedkar, and essentially the thrust of this, the main takeaway from this scholarship, is that if we focus specifically on the binaries, on only the binaries, this can leave out important alternative hierarchies. We can leave them intact and unexamined when they need to be further interrogated and further challenged. I also included, just real briefly, the Twitter handles of two prominent IR theorists who deal with race right now. A lot of the content from this lecture, as well as one of the essays you read, came from a book that they were two of the three editors, called Race and Racism in International Relations. So, you know, maybe you're not going to do anything with international relations for the rest of your life, but if this interests you, these are people, I don't know if y'all are on Twitter or not, but if you are, then you can maybe keep up with them, and that's a way to kind of follow what is going on in the field. So brief recap, just tying everything together to wrap things up. understood how race affected the development of IR. We did that really historical section. Again, a very, very 10,000 foot view. There's a lot more detail that could be added. There's a lot more definition that can be built into that, but hopefully that gives you a sense for the development of international relations and how race played a really important role in the development of the field that we're studying. The second is engaging brief vignettes on previously excluded voices. Similarly, these are brief vignettes. There's so much more to speak about, to talk about these people. One historian talks about with Mirza Tate's archive that is basically untouched, that there's virtually no record of people going in and using her work, and it's something I hope to do some in the future. But for now, just a little bit of like a taste to familiarize yourself with them. And then finally, we interacted with some recent scholarship on race and IR just to see how people are using that now, how they're theorizing race, how race is impacting their ability to theorize and think through the international order, the international sphere. And then some simple takeaways. So first, with this history, this again all lines here, but a certain way, I hope that we have a certain wariness of the racist baggage of our theorizing that our theorizing in practice may contain. So I hope that this helps us think through, hey, when we're doing IR theory, when we are engaging these texts or reading it in the future, that we always have race in our thinking. It's always there. We're keeping that in mind. We're not allowing it to be bracketed and removed from the conversation. Additionally, this is maybe a little bit of editorializing. I think there could potentially be some debates over this, but I think it's important to highlight what I would call the fallaciousness. That is entirely a too complicated word just so I could keep the parallelism of ness words, but the fallaciousness of paternalism, or what some scholars call the waiting room of history. So we saw over and over and over again this idea of saying, oh, well, these people aren't civilized enough for self-rule. They're not developed enough for self-rule. And they're not human. They haven't entered in. They're still in the waiting room of history. They're in the waiting room of modernity, waiting to enter into civilization. And there might be very legitimate concerns about, about protecting the people, as W.E.B. Du Bois brought up, but ultimately rejecting this paternalism that says, hey, I know what's best for these people. I'm going to determine what's good for them, and they don't really need to have a say in it because they're too childish. And then finally, just bringing up the helpfulness, but also the limits of racial discourse in IR. So again, this wariness, we want to keep this in mind, but also how race can potentially mask things if we are not careful to pay attention to potentially gender discrimination, as we saw in the case of Mirza Tate, or these other different like caste discrimination, et cetera, that we see in other cases. So that wraps up the content on race for today. Normally I would pause for questions, but no one likes to ask questions and hold up the class. So I will just stick around for any of those. But before you leave, I have a habit I have developed while I was tutoring English during my seminary years. My sections know this very well at this point, but anytime I teach, I like to pause briefly at the end to remind my students that your grades and academic success do not determine your worth and dignity. As a human person, you have something beautiful and wonderful to share with the world, both intellectually and otherwise. And since class is over, I now exhort you to go forth and share that good gift with others. I will stick around for questions, but unless Professor Nexon has anything else to add, y'all are free to go.